Can you just briefly explain what these charges are and what they relate to?
Yes. These charges against former President Raul Castro stem from an incident 30 years ago whereby Cuban forces shot down planes owned by and flown by an organization called Brothers to the Rescue. They entered Cuban space and they were fired upon and there were casualties. So that's what this comes from. But the bigger picture is the fact that the American administration, the Trump administration, has embarked on a campaign to change the regime in Cuba. This is just another step in that process.
Okay, the Cuban president has said that the indictment against his predecessor has represented, and I'll quote, a political manoeuvre devoid of any legal foundations by the United States. How do you see it?
I'm not an expert in international law. The way that I would interpret it is that the United States, the Trump administration, they want regime change in Cuba. They want to somehow force this regime to toe the line when it comes to U.S. interests. They've embarked on a campaign of very sustained pressure, probably the most sustained pressure we have seen since the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s. So I would say this is political and strategic. I don't know if it has much of a place in international law, but it certainly has a place in international power politics.
What sort of backroom negotiations would have been going on between the US and Cuba to date?
As near as we can tell, there have been negotiations in Havana between representatives of the Cuban government and representatives of the Trump administration. Important to understand is that the Cuban government's delegation has members, important members of the Castro family. The Castro family is still very powerful in Cuba. They are privileged, they are powerful, and they have access to a lot of resources. So the United States has been trying to push the Cuban regime, not headed by a Castro, but push that regime to embark on a whole wide array of policy changes, from releasing political prisoners to allowing for more U.S. investment in Cuba. President Trump would also like some Castros to have to leave Cuba and have the president step down. And the Cubans have been doing their best to negotiate with the Cubans, but they don't have a lot of cards to play.
In a statement published on Wednesday local time in the United States, President Trump called Cuba a rogue state harbouring hostile foreign military. What sort of threat does Cuba actually pose to America?
Frankly, Cuba poses absolutely no threat to the United States. It really doesn't. It doesn't have a nuclear program. It doesn't support international terrorism. It doesn't support America's enemies. Why? Because Cuba just has no money. I mean, it's broke. It can't keep the lights on. It can't provide basic services for its people. So Cuba doesn't pose a threat. However, the United States, the Trump administration, is very hungry right now to have a win. They're bogged down in Iran right now. They'd like to have a win that they can point to and say, see, the United States is back.
You mentioned the ordinary Cuban people there. What is life like for them, and how sustained has the economic suppression been?
It's terrible. The Cubans I talked to, in fact, I've just been messaging and WhatsApping with some of my Cuban friends. Power, if they're lucky, is on for maybe 2 to 3 hours during a 24-hour period. Gasoline has gone through the roof. It is basically inaccessible. There is no longer train travel or transport between cities. People are not able to store food in their freezers and refrigerators. This is the tropics, so that's a really big deal. The quality of healthcare has deteriorated sharply. Life is terrible for the average Cuban, and the average Cuban would like to see this crisis resolved.
Can you draw any parallels between this ramping up of pressure on Cuba and what we saw with the US and Venezuela that ultimately ended in that raid and the capture of Nicolas Maduro?
That's a very good comparison, Catherine. In fact, it seems that the Trump administration would very much like to have something happen in Cuba like what it had happened in Venezuela. This seems to be a shot across the bow of the Cuban government, which is saying, just like we indicted Maduro, we've now indicted Raul Castro, and we can come get him and humiliate you just the way we humiliated the Maduro dictatorship. So that's why I think this campaign of pressure. We saw a lot of pressure on Venezuela before the arrest of Maduro. I think that's what we're seeing right now in Cuba, a campaign of sustained pressure. with regime change in mind.
Okay, I'd also really like to get your take on the role of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in all of this. We know that his parents were Cuban immigrants. He's made comments to the effect that, you know, he's offering to forge a new relationship between the two countries. What is the significance of his involvement?
It's key. Marco Rubio, former senator from Florida, it is widely reported he wants to succeed President Trump. So what he wants is a victory. He wants to be able to say, look, everyone, especially those in Florida, I'm the one who ended the Castro regime. Other people talked about it. I'm the one who actually did it, and that is going to lock down Florida when it comes time for the Republican primary process and even the general election of 2028. So domestic politics plays a big role in this.